Panel, let's start with your reactions to David Brooks's recent New York Times column. He criticizes both the Democrat and Republican parties for not serving the function that they used to. Through history, one or the other was dominant, but now they're more like 50-50. And he says, quote, now parties are seen as religious organizations that exist to provide believers with meaning, membership, and moral sanctification. Ben, are the parties too focused in on themselves?
Not any more than they've been over the last decade, I would say. Yes, they're focused inward. Yes, they're self-absorbed, mainly reinforced by algorithms and social media. And our media that still exists, that hasn't gone to the wayside, that's being backed by advertisers that need to get the numbers. So you have that component, but they have to galvanize their base in the primaries. That's the way it's always been, and that's what they do. But we continue to get hit with the emotional component of it, and when you are interacting with something and it's emotional to you, you remember that long term versus things that don't have that impact.
Aaron, what's the role of the parties?
Yeah, so I totally actually agree with Ben here. I think that politics has become memified, right? And so we have had many substantive policy events in the last week. The Biden administration announced that we're going to remove lead pipes from all water systems in the next 10 years. Announced that we're going to apologize for the Native American boarding schools, the horrific abuse in those boarding schools. And what do we see? We see Kamala Harris calls Trump a fascist, and so did Trump's former chief of staff. Trump calls Harris a nasty woman and said something vaguely inappropriate about a golfer. J.D. Vance defends pet eating claims, right? Politics has become this meme, and when you have social media driving these memes of politics, you get this enforced tribalism. So we can talk about the base, but I think one thing that's David Brooks is really tapping into right now is in the social media world of disinformation, where people are just aligning themselves in these echo chambers. Politics has become a little bit about just what is the meme of the day instead of the substantive policy that's actually taking place in the background that nobody talks about.
Nobody talks about, Lisa?
Look, I think he's right. I think that, I mean, some of his language, you talked about political parties serving as religious organizations. He talks about the power now lies with the so-called priesthood, media figures, podcast hosts, and activists.
It's not the party bosses anymore.
No, and it's not, certainly not the candidates serving as leaders. They're being led around by the base. And they are running in fear from the base. They won't step out the lines. And I think, they sort of double down on policies that are not widely popular because out of fear of offending the base. Part of it has to do with the primary system. Because that's the only way to get through the primaries, because it's the base who votes in primaries. And so our system locks candidates into the orthodoxy of the base, and then they cannot step outside the lines once they get through that gauntlet into the general election, lest they be pilloried and chased out of office if they're so lucky to even get in.
Well, the mantra used to be you spread out after the primaries for the general.
But they don't. They can't. And I guess that's one of my frustrations with this election is that Kamala Harris didn't have to go through the gauntlet of the primaries. And so if she can't do it this time, when the other side poses such an enormous and obvious threat, then I feel like it's hopeless. I feel like Brooks is exactly right. He doesn't offer any solutions. I don't have any solutions, but I agree with what he's saying.
So maybe Michael has a solution.
Well, I will say this, though. By some accounts, the political appetite of the electorate has changed. So the power of influence may have also shifted in the sense that there's this growing mass of voters who gravitate towards Ben's points, these diatribes laced with things like emotion, feeling, opinion, hypothetical, anecdotal, speculative conjecture, versus empirically driven factual policy analysis, right? So if you look at the podcast space, for example, there are these individuals who can't speak in a complete sentence, who can't even conjugate a verb, who garner massive viewership and have lots of influence across platforms where vulnerable and sometimes not so vulnerable people listen and factor these opinions into their worldviews and their political choices in very serious ways. So to your point, Barbara, we think about the party boss idea. That may still work in sort of localized alderman races like in South Side of Chicago, But that sort of concentrated in-person influence might be waning in this contemporary moment, in my view.
What's interesting is that the Republican Party has changed. If you listen to J.D. Vance's speech at the convention, the first half of that could easily have been Bernie Sanders speaking, right? It was a populist rhetoric of the big corporations are shutting you down. Right now, you listen to RFK and Tulsi Gabbard going on, and they're talking about how corporations are poisoning us through our food. And you listen to this and you realize that there is a shift. So it's going to be really interesting to see, Mitch McConnell saying the MAGAification of the Republican Party is a problem. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next few election cycles as we continue to have this memification of politics and leaders not really leading, where the Republican Party ends up, because it is going through a bit of a shift from where it was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the George W. Bush era, to where we are now.
You're not sure the MAGA party is the party?
I think the MAGA party has become the party, and the question is that going to last through several more election cycles? I suspect it will.